Now it's our pleasure to hear some faculty research. And our first presenter is a friend, Don Ruben Hernandez Leon, who is Associate Professor of Sociology here at UCLA. He studies Mexican migration, and I remember one time I asked him to come and speak to my class, and he started off by describing the type of immigration that he researched. He said, I study Mexicans who go to weird places. And he spent a lot of time in Atlanta or in Georgia, and I'm sure he'll be giving us more about that. He wrote a book. It's called Metropolitan Migrants, The Migration of Urban Mexicans to the United States, published by UC Press, go UC Press, 2008. And he's working right now on it's a 20-year study of immigration from Mexico to a U.S. southern state, and I guess he'll be explaining some of that to us as well. He's widely published, and when you need to know what's happening with immigration, he's the person I always tell people, talk to him, he knows what's happening. Don Ruben?
Well, thank you for the invitation to participate in this event. As David mentioned, I have been working on this project for a very unusual span of time. Very few researchers can say and afford that they've been working on that or follow a particular case study for almost 2 decades. And in any event, this is this idea of studying Mexicans in weird places is actually not my phrase. I have to say it comes actually from one of my colleagues in sociology, in the Department of Sociology. He says, Ruben studies, those kinds of flows of, Mexicans that go to these very unusual places, Mexicans in weird places. And so this is the unusual place, just to set the stage very quickly. In the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s and even the 2000s, there was a very important process of dispersion of the Mexican population in the United States. Mexicans, many Mexican migrants, going to places that did not have a long history or tradition of Mexican migration, and many places in the Northeast, some places in the southeastern United States, the parts of the Midwest that had not received Mexican migrants in a long time. So this particular case study that I've been following and studying with a colleague in Mexico is Dalton, Georgia, which is located in the northern part of the state of Georgia. And Dalton's claim to fame is actually its manufacturing production. And what is actually manufactured in this particular and small city is actually something that we are actually stepping on right now, which is wall-to-wall carpets. So many of the big companies that produce rugs and carpets, that are used for these kinds of venues, but also in many new homes, actually come from this small corner of the northwestern part of the state of Georgia. About 80 to 90% of all the carpets that are produced in the United States actually come from this particular locality and its surrounding region. So when you are, when you usually go to Dalton, you fly to Atlanta, you drive north, and about an hour into the drive to Dalton, you start to see these plants on both sides of the I-75 highway that tell you that you're getting to the carpet capital of the world, as Dalton and Daltonians like to call themselves and call their place, right? This is actually in the title of my presentation, Mexican Migration to the Carpet Capital of the World. So Mexicans started to arrive there, recruited to work in poultry and construction in the early 70s. And for almost 2 decades, these Mexican populations remained actually quite small, despite the fact that those who were recruited started to spread the news and the information through their networks that there were jobs in Dalton. And what was interesting is that these folks who were recruited to work in poultry and construction, they quickly realized that there was something else, some other kinds of jobs that paid better wages and that had much better conditions. And those were the jobs in the carpet industry. So despite the fact that migrants did what they usually do, which is communicate to their networks this kind of information, the community grew more or less at a relatively slow pace. Things, of course, changed dramatically for Dalton, for Daltonians, and for many of the Mexicans who ended up migrating there in the early 1990s, when a huge wave of migration literally changed the face, the demographic makeup of this small city. And what was special, slightly different from other cases or other moments in the history of Mexico-US migration, is that the Mexicans who started to migrate to Dalton in this new period, in this new era of migration, migrated with their families. And that represented a huge transformation and had a huge impact across a variety of social fields and arenas. These were no longer the single men who would room with other men and who would, essentially go as Mexican migrants have long said, de la casa al trabajo, from home to work. And but in fact, as they brought spouses and children, their presence actually had a huge impact on, for example, the local schools. So one of the things that I'm writing about these days, because as David mentioned, my colleague and I are actually writing the final product of this research after writing and publishing many articles and book chapters and an edited volume and so on. We're writing this sort of final monograph based on this study. But one of the things that we're writing about on this is the way in which this large scale, and it's large scale relative to the size of the city, right? Large scale, very rapid wave of migration actually fractured the local society. In migration studies, certainly in the United States, we have been obsessed with the migrants for obvious reasons, right? So we study how the migrant becomes part of the labor force, where the trajectories of migration are, the causes of migration, the kinds of impacts in the home country or the home communities. But we have left relatively abandoned the field of, or the study of the impacts that migration has on local communities. And this is a kind of, almost a kind of bias on, in the field of migration studies, as if migrants arrive in a kind of vacuum, right? And this is a huge error, so a huge mistake in my view. What we have been able to study in this particular locality is actually how different social actors, different institutions in Dalton actually took different positions vis-a-vis migration, contradictory positions, positions that actually confronted them in the face of this large-scale migration. Now, let me just take a moment here to just tell you what I mean here and give you some figures. I didn't prepare any slides. I'm doing this sort of old-fashioned. But in the 1980 census, Latinos, if we use the category Latino as a proxy for Mexican immigrants, in the 1980 census, Dalton had less than 1% Latinos. In 1990, the Latino population was almost 3%. In 2000, the Latino population was 40%. So you can imagine the kind of sea change that migration produced in this locality. Again, I emphasize the fact that it was not just the numbers of migration, but the quality of this migration, right? It was no longer single men, it was actually families. So, but to go back to the topic that I was addressing, the kinds of fractures, the kinds of discussions, debates that migration produced in the local society, are the kinds of things that we have left relatively unstudied in the field of immigration and international migration. I'll give you just one example of what I'm talking about exactly. This migration, large-scale migration of Mexican migrants and their families changed the composition of local schools, right? Today, of course, the Dalton public school system is majority Latino. As a result of this migration, there has been what we have seen elsewhere in other places, a kind of white flight, in which many of the families have actually taken their kids out of school, moved them to private academies, private schools, a lot of Christian academies in this part of the United States, and so on. But at the same time as we saw this type of reaction unfolding in the schools, we actually saw how the schools as an institution actually responded in more or less what we could call a positive way to this flow. These schools started to have discussions on multiculturalism, started to engage Mexican institutions, started to develop programs to bring bilingual teachers from Mexico, started to make changes to the curriculum to incorporate the cultural experience and the educational needs, most important, of these new students. So, in fact, for some period of time in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the local public school system became famous in certain academic and educational circles precisely because of the kinds of programs that these schools were putting together and developing in the context of these very significant inflow of Mexican children. Of course, things started to change very quickly in the 2000s, particularly as Republicans took over essentially every statewide elected position in the state of Georgia. So if there was a wave of migration in a few years before, now there was a wave of anti-immigrant measures that actually materialize in state laws, state legislature, as well as in local ordinances, which actually try to essentially deflect migrants to make their lives as difficult and uncomfortable as possible so they would, go elsewhere. Coupled, as you know, with this type of development, later in the decade, the economic crisis had a very severe impact on the U.S. economy in general, but also in particular industries. And one of the industries that was actually most affected was precisely the carpet industry. Why? Because carpets are intimately connected to construction, right? And as this construction and real estate bubble deflated in the latter part of the 2000s, allied industries like the carpet industry suffered dramatically. About 50% of the jobs in the carpet industry disappeared in a matter of a couple of years. And that started to produce something that we have seen in other eras of Mexican migration, which is a very sizable return flow. Many of these Mexican migrants who had arrived and lived there for more than a decade started to consider other places of residence in the US, but many of them ended up actually returning to Mexico. Of course, return migration, as I mentioned, has long been a feature of the Mexico-US migratory system. One of the things that we are very interested in sort of analyzing and documenting is how Mexican migration to Dalton, to this particular locality in northwest Georgia, is very much a sort of a microcosm of the larger migratory system, but also in a way it sort of condenses a long history of Mexico-US migration, in which the US has had these, and the US and American society, I think, in general, has had this sort of, schizophrenic disposition towards Mexican migration. Of course, as we know, in times of, in good economic times, it's time to recruit and bring on masses of Mexican workers. And when things are bad, when things turn bad, there's an economic recession or an economic crisis, it is actually time to remove these workers, and send them back. This is sort of a long-standing dynamic and long-standing theme of Mexico-US migration. So most political economists with a historical inclination will tell you that this is Mexico-US migration in its essence, right? This is the basic dynamic. But at the same time, what we have seen in Dalton are actually new forces that produce or have worked towards an inclusion, an integration of Mexicans, Mexican immigrants, Mexican children, Mexican families in the fabric of the local society. Of course, participation, incorporation into the labor market produces that, to some extent. But so does, and very powerfully, the incorporation of these Mexican children in the American educational system. In the fact that schools are actually very powerful institutions of integration of children in this society. And finally, actually, one thing that I did not mention is that one of the advantages of following this case study for 20 years is that we not only see these changes in terms of these patterns and historical dynamics and so forth and so on, but we actually see changes in the population itself. And one of the most important transformations that will have an enduring impact on Dalton is the fact that a second generation has come of age during this period. So a lot of the children that we saw actually, running around in the schools and the various places that we studied earlier on in this project are actually now young adults who have entered the labor market, who are studying in the local, four-year college now, who have developed all sorts of connections and roots to the local society. So certainly through the second generation, we can see this sort of long-term imprint and impact of migration in this particular place. So finally, and just to conclude, what we see as one of the very interesting things in this process is that although we can see and trace these long historical pattern of attraction and expulsion with the cycles of economic development in the US of these Mexican migrants, we also see after each cycle, after each iteration of this process, deeper connections and deeper roots that Mexicans develop and Mexican families and Mexican communities develop. Now, not just with Los Angeles, but with many other communities, just like Dalton in the United States. These connections run now deeper and actually are much more multi-stranded as these communities and their families have developed relations with different institutions in different arenas of Mexican society.
Thank you, Don Ruben. Our next presenter is Frédéric Somad. He's a professor at the Department of Social Anthropology at Aix-Marseille University. And he's a member of the Institute of Ethnological Mediterranean Studies, European and Comparative. But he loves ranching, cowboy life. That is what he really has been working on. He's a specialist in studying bullfighting and the cultures that evolve out of that, both in the southwestern Europe and here in California and in Mexico. So he's written some interesting books, and he has a new one I love the title. The latest book is called Cowboys, Clowns, and Toreros. Cowboys, Clowns, and Toreros. And I just can't wait to hear about it. So, Frederic.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers and the UCLA and the IDEA and Amandine, which is driving all this with the hand of a master. I will present part of this work, the ultimate work I've done with my colleague and friend geographer Jean-Baptiste Maudet. We did a 3 years long field work in California about bull games and cattle ranching in California among different communities that are involved in this kind of activity as a paradigm of the complex relationship between the constriction of the United States nation and its margins and the population that have been marginalized in this process, at first Mexican and Indian, but also black population and even queer, gay population that are also running their own rodeo games, which is, I think, it's very significant. I have to say that this work, this field work, has been funded by the French Agence Nationale de la Recherche, ANR, and it was a fantastic means for us to do this job. And the result is a video documentary that we have presented 2 years ago in the humanities building, and that you can, if you're interested, you can see it freely online. I could give you the link for this. And this book that, if you don't mind, I could pass you by if you want to have a look on this. It has beautiful pictures, and so we are now struggling in order to publish it in America, but it's not so easy. Anyway, I'm now with my topic. Stigmatization of the popular morals of Mexico has grown in recent decades, owing especially to the border tensions around immigration and drug trafficking. In this respect, the practice of bull sports could be considered a marker of the irreducible division between Hispanic Mexico, supposedly characterized by boisterous sociability, and the United States, whose culture, impregnated with a Puritan ethic inherited from its Anglo-Saxon roots, upholds affection toward animals as a moral responsibility. Of course, this caricatural opposition is filled with bias, since extreme violence plagues U.S. society as well. Moreover, that society is far from culturally homogeneous. It is made up of elements of civilization from all parts of the world, among which those from Ibero-American countries. And despite the weight of the dominant ideology, which tends to accord animals a status approaching that of humans, the bull arena is a highly popular attraction. This includes events like the rodeo, also its recognition as a national sport emblematic of the United States continues to incite opposition among the guardians of animalry morals. Indeed, the tension within Anglo-American society around the rodeo and the various competition it comprises derive from a hidden reality that we bring to light here. This sport's fundamental connection to bullfighting and the Hispano-Mexican stamp of its origins in an influence that the Anglo-American hegemony has never been able to eradicate. Certainly, rodeo are not the same as a corrida, bullfights in which the bull is killed. In fact, such killing is forbidden in the United States. But there is much more to bull sports than the corrida. A multitude of events involving bulls and horses that are not killed exist in southwestern Europe and all the Americas. Rodeo is one of these. All belong to the same family of spectator sports that developed along a historical continuum with the Iberian Peninsula as its epicenter. The formal differences that distinguish these sports, even those as significant as killing or not killing, are differences of degree, not of their basic nature. The most striking evidence of the pertinence of such a statement lies in the core of American rodeo's principal attraction, the bull riding, and the necessary safeguard, the so-called bullfighter or rodeo clowns. So this is a paradoxical heritage, a bullfighting heritage of the rodeo, but beside it, our ethnographic inquiry takes in a proliferation of alternative events in the bull ring, particularly in the states along the border that record the diversity of southwestern Europe bull sports. In this regard, California offers the richest array, with up to 7 different forms of the genre, including classic rodeo and concerning, beyond the classical white cowboy, diverse communities that have been once marginalized by the spread of the WASP civilization onto the West and by the consecutive American dreams, like Afro-Americans, Native American, Portuguese American, queers, and of course, Mexican American. Mexican communities practice unique types of rodeo, charreada and jaripeo, often in spite of legal restrictions and outcry from animal rights advocates who interpret the immigrants' methods as a clear sign of their intrinsic Spaniard barbarism. Even more surprising, California law, on the basis of religious freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, allows the Azorian Portuguese community to hold bloodless bullfights in which no lances or swords are used and the bull is not killed, in the context of its religious festivals. These events attract relatively important crowds where Luso-Californians mix with Mexican around the Plaza de Toros. There are 13 bull rings in California held by Portuguese Americans. These festivals are regularly protested by the animal rights activists, but they benefit from the protection of the law. Meanwhile, the case of the Mexican rodeo is more complex. It splits into 2 different styles: the charreada, which is the official Mexican national sport, and the jaripeo, which is the Mexican form of bull riding, and they have both spread throughout the American territory. Charreada is an elite team sport that requires the participant to own at least one, but preferably several good quarter horses, stables, a van, equipment, and clothes, and hats with large, richly embroidered brims. The official meetings are held under the authority of the Mexican Federation of Charreria, and out of a total of 900 affiliated associations, around 100 can be found in the United States. They are spread across 14 states, with California in first position, followed by Texas and then Illinois, organized by a system of hierarchical and transnational regional competition, enabling the best American teams to compete in the final that takes place in Mexico each year. The nationalist creed held by Charreada, as demonstrated the anthropologist Olga Nájera Ramirez from Santa Cruz University, goes hand by hand with the protocol that associate the Mexican and American flags and anthem at the opening of each show, in spite of the fact that certain canonical practices on Mexican soil are forbidden in all parts of American territory. Clearly, the charreada practiced in the United States is subjected to particularly strong legislative vigilance, probably due to the status and the visibility of this Mexican official national sport. Nevertheless, the jaripeo, Mexican bull riding, seems to go unnoticed, probably due to the fact that it is a kind of show that concerns exclusively Mexican Americans from the lower social classes, from the small towns in the San Joaquin Valley and the surrounding neighborhoods of Los Angeles, that the successive waves of migration have transformed into real Mexican branches. Now, in Mexico, the jaripeo distinguishes itself from American bull riding. Here, the bull rider has hooked spurs, espuelas de gancho, that are dug into the animal ribs, enabling the bull rider to remain on the back of the bull well beyond the regulatory 8 seconds in the American rodeo. Moreover, the use of espuela de gancho in bull riding results in a technical transformation, whereas the American Cowboys try to remain on the bull's back by gripping tightly with one hand on an abdominal strap that was beforehand attached around the animal chest. The Mexican jinete, Mexican bull rider, riding with iron-crossed spurs, hold with both his hand and heels, helped by the hooked spurs. This Mexican particularity is readily emphasized as a reversal by the jinete, for when they let go of the rope in full action, they demonstrate by this feat of magic bull riding, without the hands, that they are stronger than their gringo counterparts. However, these spurs are supposed to be prohibited in the States, but as they do not injure the bulls, they are silently tolerated by the authority, or simply unnoticed, because in some places of the San Joaquin Valley or in LA agglomeration, Mexicans can do their own festival by themselves, and nobody knows it, and so they can use any instrument that they want to do their Mexican rodeo as they want it, which is not the case of the charros that are very supervised by the authority, because they are very known and very suspected as Mexican to be harmful to the animals. So it's all paradox. And definitely charros are a little bit despective towards the jaripeo. Charros are upper class or middle class people, and they look with despective eyes the action of the jaripeo maniacs, as it's not serving the Mexican cause in the United States. But anyway, they are doing it, and very often, and moreover in the Los Angeles agglomeration, which it seems to be focusing the popular jaripeo. And last Sunday with Amandine, we saw Mexican feast from Oaxacan people, Zapotecas, and among the religious festival there was a jaripeo, and they were using these hooked spurs, and there were only Mexican a part of us, So this is an almost unknown California, except for the member of the concerned communities, that reveals a profound historical and anthropological reality, the Hispano-Mexican origin of the rodeo games and open range cattle ranching that gave birth to the American Western tradition. Let's first consider a striking contradiction. How did extensive livestock breeding and the Western tradition of Hispano-Mexican origin become such widespread symbols of Anglo-American civilization? Thanks to rodeo shows and Hollywood movies, the alterity found on the old frontier was reversed. In movies, the power of the cowboy, a national hero, is expressed in his mastery of a violent relation toward wild animality, a relation that the Mexican vaquero and the Indian hunter-warriors were actually the first to have experienced. Indian warrior hunter in the hunting techniques that I demonstrate in the book, that are one of the bases of the cattle rancher American, Western American techniques, and most of all, the use of the lasso. However, much Anglo-American civilization might deny this unmentionable lineage. The Los Angeles area makes a space for the meshed sprawl of an urban structure of multiple enclaves and divisions that, without doubt, favor the imprecise boundaries between tolerance de facto and semi-clandestinity. Its inextricable complexity seems to offer an opportunity to deconstruct the radical linearity of the present-day US-Mexican international boundary, reproducing the American-Mexican border interfaces in an almost infinite fractal form based on segregated urban spaces, giving birth to small pieces of Mexican land each time a jaripeo and its festive environment are organized. It is therefore logical that the main breeding of jaripeo bulls is found in the agro-urban grid in the outer suburbs of this city that typically occupies small plots like the breeding farm of the Portuguese American 3 minutes. And I'm sorry, I'm cutting, but I'm sorry. There is we worked with Portuguese American bull breeder. That is, he got a space of intensive dairy farming that he converted in bull breeding for the jaripeo, and it is in Chino, in the LA agglomeration, and which all these paradoxes of this urbanization and plot of agricultural lands that have remained in the complex development of the agglomeration of Los Angeles. So I conclude. Analysis of the various types of rodeo and bull sport observed in California highlights the state's border location and the indelible stamp left by elements of Hispano-Mexican culture that resisted U.S. hegemony. The communitarianism revealed by this variant is, of course, a characteristic of U.S. society in general, but here it is particularly alive, having experienced a dynamic renewal in recent history thanks to the impact of civil rights movements and other countercultural expressions in California. Such a context of human geography promotes the effect of fragmentation within a genre of spectacle that is polymorphic in nature, displaying a host of contradictory values, both serious and mocking in spirit, with influences at once Anglo and Ibero-American, urban and rural, middle and lower class. It elicits both U.S. patriotism and communitarian pride. But while the comparative ethnography of bull sport can shed light on this variation, it also uncovers relations of continuity with regards to the bullfighting heritage of these games and the moral problem posed by their presence within U.S. society. This tension between a common source, the properties of agonistic games, and its modulations, the identity-based distinctions of each community involved. This tension can be resolved in a dialectical configuration articulating cultural contrasts, socio-economic differences, and the geographical locations of these types of spectacle. The ethnographic approach of livestock breeding uncovers, beyond the various avenues of specialization, a more or less accepted network of collaboration and solidarity among the different forms of cattle raising and of rodeo games and bull games for the purpose of sport, and between these and more classic ways of ranching, dairy or feedlot, breeding or beef ranching. This original mode of production, which associates agricultural strategy with sports performance, turning the farmer into a show business entrepreneur, lies in the interstice of intensive farming and the system of urbanization characteristic of California, taking advantage of the margin of a nature that has been transformed since the white man began exploiting its formidable riches, the resource of both the land and the envisioned landscape. Thank you.
Our final presenter today is Martin van Delden, who is professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese here at UCLA. He received his BA from the University of Cambridge, his MA from the University of Utrecht, and a PhD from Columbia University. And then he's been on a number of other faculties. He was at New York University, Rice University, and then University of Southern California. But luckily he saw the light, and now he is here, a Bruin. I guess we'll talk about that later. He has written a book, among others, Carlos Fuentes, Mexico and Modernity, which was awarded the Outstanding Scholarly Book. And the one I can't wait to hear about, he's co-author, titled Gunshots at the Fiesta, Literature and Politics in Latin America. Sounds like fun. Martin?
Thank you, David. And I also want to begin by thanking the organizers of this symposium. To begin with, of course, Amandine, who has worked extremely hard to make this event happen and to make this event successful. I also want to thank my colleagues, Efrain Cristal from the Department of Comparative Literature, Kevin Terraciano from the Latin American Institute, who have given their support and organized this event, and Professor Jacques Bautier and other colleagues from the Institut des Amériques also for having brought us all together here. And I don't want to forget all of the people behind the scenes, the staff from the Department of Comparative Literature and from the Latin American Institute, and the film crew from the International Institute. Amandine, maybe at some point you can tell us when and where we'll be able to watch ourselves. No, because the event is being taped, isn't it? Ah, okay. We don't know. Okay, so my topic is the US-Mexico border in recent literary and cultural criticism. By recent, I mean criticism of the last quarter century, approximately. So I'll be looking at a number of critics from the late 80s, early 90s, up to the mid 90s, and then some recent critics. And of course, since I don't have very much time, I'll be giving a very compressed account of what I regard as some representative works on the US-Mexico border, which has, of course, in the last 25 years or so, attracted enormous amount of attention from literary and cultural critics. And what I'll be doing is sketching a shift from a type of discourse that emerges in the late 80s and early 90s, which emphasizes the notion of deterritorialization, and of course I will explain in a few moments what's meant by that, a shift from that kind of discourse to a more recent approach or discourse to this subject of the US-Mexico border, where critics talk about re-territorialization and sort of reject the positions that were taken earlier on. So my two examples of the discourse of deterritorialization deterritorialization from about a quarter century ago are in the first place Nestor Garcia Canclini, an Argentinian Mexican anthropologist. He's of Argentinian origin but has been working in Mexico for a very, very long time. And the second example is Oscar Martinez, a Mexican-American historian who teaches has been teaching for a very long time at the University of Arizona and has authored a series of books on the U.S.-Mexico border. So Nestor Garcia Canclini published a book titled Culturas Híbridas, a very influential book titled Culturas Híbridas. It came out in 1989, and it includes what is actually a very short chapter, maybe about 10 or 12 pages on the city of Tijuana. Which I venture to say had not really attracted an enormous amount of interest from theorists from other parts of the world up until this point. Garcia Canclini mentions in an interview from a few years ago, an interview that I'll refer to again a little later on in my talk, mentions that he first visited Tijuana in 1979 and was very attracted to the city because he felt that Tijuana offered an alternative to the heavily nationalist culture that he was accustomed to living and working in Mexico City. And then he returned, and in the years 1985 to 1988, he conducted research there and then published this as part of his book Culturas Híbridas, which was translated into English as Hybrid Cultures, published this brief account, 10 or 12 pages, of the city of Tijuana. So what does he say about Tijuana? Well, I'm going to identify two themes and try to understand the relationship between them, and then I'm also going to try to set his account, his approach to Tijuana in its specific historical and cultural context. So the two themes are, in the first place, he describes Tijuana as a laboratory of postmodernity, like New York. And I believe that, at this time, again, this would probably have been regarded as a surprising claim. But thanks to Garcia Canclini's work, it soon became actually a kind of stereotype about Tijuana. So a laboratory of postmodernity. He says that in Tijuana, one can find, I quote, the most innovative reflections on deterritorialization. So in the first place, he describes Tijuana as a multicultural city, or he uses terms like binational, bicultural, bilingual, intercultural, multicultural, multifocal. So all of these terms are used in order to capture this aspect of the city of Tijuana. So the idea is that instead of a bounded culture, a Mexican culture, you have a mixture. You have, to use the term he himself gives pride of place to, you have a hybrid culture. Now, the other theme that he introduces in his essay on Tijuana is that the culture of Tijuana, according to Garcia Canclini, is a culture of simulation. And the example that he gives of that is, for those of you who have visited Tijuana, is of the burros, the famous burros, which have been painted to look like zebras. And as a tourist, I guess you pay and you can take a ride on this burro, which is simulating to be a zebra. And Garcia Canclini regards this as representative of a larger culture of simulation. In other words, a culture in which ideas of authenticity or the natural don't matter anymore. Instead, the idea is that culture is playful, fake, artificial, and so on. So I think actually this combination between this idea of the multicultural city and the simulated city, it's a little surprising. It's not. I don't think it's an automatic combination. He doesn't really explain how these two themes come together, and to illustrate why I think this is not a natural joining of themes, we can think of the topic of mestizaje that was introduced in very interesting ways in the first panel. There's a long tradition, as was mentioned, of discussions of Latin American culture as being a culture of mestizaje, from El Inca Garcilaso de la Vega to José Vasconcelos, and none of these authors present mestizo culture as a culture of simulation, as being artificial or inauthentic or anything like that. But in Garcia Canclini, then, the theme of hybridity, which is kind of an updating of mestizaje, really, although shorn of its ethnic and racial components, gets linked to this notion of simulation. Now, in order to explain how those two themes get brought together, I want to step back for a moment and discuss the context of this essay. So first of all, the late 80s, when he writes this essay and talks about Tijuana as a laboratory of postmodernity, or the period of the decline of the ideology of revolutionary nationalism in Mexico. So in the political realm, this is reflected, in the gradual decay of the pre-regime, the tentative efforts towards democratization in the 1980s. In the economic realm, it's the reduction of the role of the state in the Mexican economy. And in the cultural realm, I would say in the increasing prominence of critiques of nationalist ideology coming out of Mexico. And the prime example of that, I can only give one, is Roger Bartra's La Jaula de la Melancolía, which is a kind of deconstruction of the whole ideology of nationalism that had been so strong in Mexico throughout the 20th century. So I think Garcia Canclini needs to be situated in that context. He is participating in this critique of nationalism. And in fact, this is in this interview that I mentioned a moment ago, that's what he says. He says, I was trying to counter this essentialist way of thinking about Mexican national identity that was so powerful in the 70s and 80s when he was going into decline in the 80s, but so powerful in the 70s when he first arrived in Mexico. And then the other influence that I want to mention that helps us see how he brings in the theme of simulation is actually French theory. So at one point in his essay, he quotes Michel de Certeau, the French theorist and philosopher who, as you may know, was a professor at UCSD for a while, and who talked about California culture as a culture of simulation, or as a nomadic kind of boundless culture. He deduced from the fact that there's no a national ID card in the United States that people don't have identities. It seems a little hyperbolic to me, but that was his conclusion. And of course, the notion of simulation had been explored by, or introduced into theoretical discourse of the time by Jean Baudrillard, who was describing postmodern society as or culture as a culture of simulation. So that's where Garcia Canclini, gets this idea of simulation from, and he introduces it then into this discussion of Tijuana culture as simultaneously one of multiculturalism. So the connection then is that the idea is if you have a multicultural culture, then you're breaking the link with a notion of an essential culture, with the notions of roots and authenticity, and therefore then it would be a culture of simulation. Okay, and let me move on quickly then to my second example. I realize if I continue like this, I might not even get to my discourse of re-territorialization, but I'll summarize Oscar Martinez very quickly. As I mentioned, he's written extensively on the US-Mexico border, and the book that I'm going to focus on here is one from 1994, and it's called Border People, Life and Society in the US-Mexico Borderlands. And in this book, it's really a kind of ethnography, because what he does on the basis of interviews that he conducted with people who live in the borderlands, he develops a typology of different characters, different character types of people who live in the borderlands. And so he goes from, at one extreme he has the national borderlanders, that is people either in Mexico or in the United States who have a strong attachment to their national identities and are not interested in, the experiences, or not interested in having much contact with people from other cultures. And then at the other pole, he has the transnational borderlanders who lead lives of intense interaction with people from the other culture or from other cultures. And the interesting thing is that he says then that the transnational borderlanders, that is those who, they're bilingual, bicultural, they have a lot of interaction with people on other sides of the border or people belonging to different ethnic groups on their side of the border, that these are the true borderlanders. They belong to the core of the borderland experience, whereas the national borderlanders are on the periphery, right? And so this is all part of a kind of a prediction that he makes about cultural trends, where he says that in the future, this process of the transnational borderlanders will become more and more important. Their type of experience, which is one of mixing cultures, coalescing cultures. He talks of integration and fusion. That's going to predominate more and more in the future, whereas the national borderlanders are going to kind of end up as relics of history. So in a way, it's an extremely optimistic book, a book that sees a new cosmopolitan identity evolving on the US-Mexico border and sees this as a kind of model for the world as a whole. And it's very interesting because in 1988, Oscar Martinez had published a book titled Troublesome Border, A History of the US-Mexico Border, in which his approach is the total opposite. There, the emphasis is entirely on conflict between the two sides. Conflict, ethnic and racial conflict, but also conflict over the exact demarcation of the border, conflict over water rights. So those are the main themes of that book, which he had published just 6 years earlier. And so in Border People, it's kind of 1994, so maybe this was the optimism of NAFTA or something like that. It was a very different perspective, and he's forecasting a kind of integration ultimately of the two countries. Okay, let me move on quickly then to my next stage, which comes in the 2000s. And obviously, I'm giving a very rapid overview here. But what we see in the 2000s then is a very strong reaction against the discourse that I've just described. And my examples are, first of all, Heriberto Yepes, who is a Mexican novelist and essayist and kind of all-round enfant terrible of Mexican literature. He's from Tijuana and still relatively young, born in 1971. And so in the 2000s, he publishes several books about Tijuana. One is titled Made in Tijuana, and the other one is titled Tijuanologías. And one of his aims in this book is to polemicize with Garcia Canclini. Although he's also respectful towards Garcia Canclini. He clearly doesn't want to get into a major fight with him. But the overall argument is that Garcia Canclini was wrong. So first, he rejects the idea that Tijuana is a multicultural or cosmopolitan city. In his typically blunt fashion, he states, es una mentira flagrante que en Tijuana se respire un ambiente de mayor multiculturalismo o cosmopolitismo. So in other words, it's a flagrant lie that in Tijuana you breathe an air of greater multiculturalism or cosmopolitanism. And he says, that for him, Tijuana, the culture of Tijuana is characterized by conflict all around, Mexicanos contra Chicanos, Gringos contra Mexicanos, Mestizos contra Indígenas, and so on. So that's his view of Tijuana, is that it's a very conflictive cultural space and not one in which you see integration. He also rejects the idea that Tijuana is a hybrid, so clearly that's a reference to Garcia Canclini. He says, la metáfora de la hibridación probó ser ingenua, neoliberal, hegeliana. So neoliberal, that's very interesting because now he's pointing to the fact that he's arguing, and this obviously must have been very painful for Garcia Canclini, who was clearly didn't see himself as an ideologue of neoliberalism, but he's arguing that the idea of the discourse of hybridity really feeds into the discourse of neoliberalism and neoliberal economic policies that were developed in the 1990s and 2000s. And then, he has a few other points, but I think those are the main points that I want to summarize before I move on to another example, which is how many more minutes do I have, Amandine? Okay, so good. I'm on target here. So my final example here, and this is also of the reaction against the discourse on hybridity concerning Tijuana, is a co-edited book by Josh Kuhn and Fiamma Montezemolo, titled Tijuana Dreaming, Life and Art at the Global Border, published by Duke University Press in 2012. Josh Kuhn is a professor at the University of Southern California, and I meant to say that, as regards to my appointment at the University of Southern California, I always, when I mention this to my students on the first day of class, I always say, I do apologize for that, but it was only for 2 years. I came over here as fast as I could. And Fiamma Montesemolo is an Italian anthropologist who now lives in California. And I should mention as background that Fiamma Montesemolo had done a book before with Heriberto Yepes, a kind of coffee table book about Tijuana, which has a lot of photographs of the city and a lot of data, so information about the population, economic statistics, and so on. And the title of the book is This is Tijuana. So the title in itself is very significant because this is obviously a reference to Ce n'est pas une pipe, right? The René Magritte painting, which was adopted by post-structuralist philosophers as kind of an emblem of a whole discourse of questioning the notion of representation. So he's by calling the book This is Tijuana, they're kind of refuting Garcia Canclini, who says that Tijuana sort of doesn't exist because it's all simulated. And they're saying, this is Tijuana. We've got all these data here, and so Tijuana actually exists. So I think it's a very clever way of countering the discourse of hybridity and simulation. Now, the collection of essays by Kuhn and Montesemolo, it's actually a diverse collection. So there are some contributors here who do go back to the discourse of hybridity and talk a lot about mixing and coalescence and so on and so forth. But the principal line is actually hostile. And there's an interview in here, that's the interview that I referred to earlier, with Nestor Garcia Canclini, where Garcia Canclini is given the opportunity to renounce his earlier ideas, which he does. He says, yes, first of all, he puts them in context, as I also did. He says, well, this was part of a reaction against essentialist thinking about national identity at the time. So that's what I was trying to do. But when I look back now, he says, I kind of regret, or I think that I overemphasize the notion of the permeability of the border or of the mobility of borderland culture. So he kind of takes it back, and the emphasis on of this volume is primarily, as is clear from the introduction, it's primarily on conflict, on inequality. So, for example, they say, the editors of the book say that they are interested in the impact of asymmetrical global economic international information networks and ravenous neoliberal trends and fiscal policy. So their emphasis is more on economic, differing economic interests, how economic policies produce inequality and therefore lead to a reinforcement of borders. So I think that this is a significant moment in this new turn that I'm trying to describe. So now for my conclusion, in an earlier version of this paper, I attempted to make a prediction as to where the debate on the US-Mexico border might go, and I now think that might be a little bit risky. So instead of that, I just want to kind of recapitulate and very briefly assess these two different positions. First of all, the more recent position with the emphasis on reterritorialization is one that I broadly agree with, but I think many of these critics also often overstate their case. And I'll give you a very brief example of how that might come out. Kuhn and Montesemolo in their introduction talk about how the US-Mexico border is the only place where the richest country in the world has a border with one of the world's poorest countries. Now, that is simply wrong. Mexico is not one of the world's poorest countries. It's ranked somewhere around 55th out of 160 countries by, most of the institutions that do these kinds of rankings, the World Bank. And so I think that the mistake says something about the approach of these critics. In other words, they want to make Mexico look a lot worse than it actually is in order to reinforce an argument about, the inevitability of conflict between the two nations or the two economies. At the same time, when I look back at Garcia Canclini and the other authors from the early 1990s, I'm struck by how remote that kind of thinking seems from our times, and that it's really, it belongs to that particular moment in time of the 1990s where there was this tremendous optimism, and again, a kind of overstated optimism about how the nation state was going to disappear and, borders were going to be erased and so on and so forth, which seems to me to be, especially from a present vantage point, very, very naive. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much.